Okay, I think we'll get going. Welcome everyone to this Root Capital webinar. Thanks for joining us. I'm Scott MacDonald, Chief External Affairs Officer at Root, and I'm going to be moderating today's event. I'll start by covering some housekeeping for the webinar. First is the format. We're going to have a 20 to 25 minute presentation, followed by a question and answer session. Please submit your questions at any time via the Zoom Q&A button on the bar at the bottom of your screen. We'll try and answer as many questions as possible live during the Q&A, and we'll follow up with written responses for those that we can't get to during the session. So please provide your name and organization with your question. For simultaneous Spanish interpretation, click the interpretation button in the Zoom controls at the bottom of your screen and select Spanish. You're also able to view the presentation slides in either English or Spanish. Use the View Options drop-down at the top of your screen and select English or Espanol under Shared Screen. Both are being cast simultaneously, so be sure to select the correct language for you. Today's program, we're diving into Root Capital's gender lens investing work and research findings from our recent report, Inclusion Pays, with our Chief Programs Officer, Alexandra Tuinstra, and the Director of our Women in Agriculture Initiative, Leonor Gutiérrez. But first, I'm going to turn it over to Root Capital founder and CEO Willy Foote for some brief remarks. Willy, over to you.
Thanks, Scott. And huge thanks to everyone for attending this webinar today and for your interest in what we've learned over a decade of intentionally investing in rural women. First off, for those who don't know, I'm Willy Foote, and I founded Root Capital over 20 years ago with the mission of investing in the growth of agricultural enterprises and thereby building a more prosperous, inclusive, and resilient future for rural communities. And we do this through a credit plus capacity building model that has helped improve the lives of more than 10 million people in farming families. And gender lens investing has been a huge part of our journey. Hence, we're really excited today to share our new research, Inclusion Pays, the returns on investing in women in agriculture, which was a rather large undertaking, analyzing $1 billion in investments to more than 550 agricultural enterprises across the globe over 10 years. Now, before I dive into the findings, I want to acknowledge and thank a few folks who were instrumental in shaping this research. First, Charlotte Wagner and the Wagner Foundation, a longtime partner in our Women in Agriculture initiative, also known as The Way, whose insights have strengthened our approach to gender lens investing in so many ways across the years. Next, we want to thank all the members of our research advisory committee, including folks from Gender Smart, the DFC, Development Finance Corporation, Impact Frontiers, Value for Women, and Calvert Impact Capital. Thanks to all of you. Your thoughtful feedback ensured that this research is useful not only for Root Capital, but to the broader community that can learn from these findings. And finally, many, many thanks to the multitude of Root Capital team members and staff, as well as the consultants who authored this research, Katie Nave and Vincent Moeller, who contributed their expert analysis and reflections to this body of work. So this year, as many of you may know, Root Capital is celebrating the 10th anniversary of our Women in Agriculture initiative. And the biggest lesson for us at Root Capital has been that gender inclusion cannot be an afterthought or an add-on to our programming. It's not a nice to have, but a must have. Women's leadership and participation in agricultural enterprises makes these enterprises stronger. And as we know from over 20 years of deploying our credit plus capacity building model at Root, those strong enterprises have real ripple effects in rural communities. They create jobs, they increase incomes, they provide opportunities to the next generation, they build rural resilience to climate shocks and other shocks. So I'm going to turn this over to Alexandra and Leonor in a second to go deeper into our findings. But I want to close by saying that our aim in sharing this today is to urge other lenders and other investors to grow their own investment in rural women and in women. We already knew that investing in women was the right thing to do, but a decade of work in learning and measurement encapsulated in the findings we're about to discuss have proven that it's also the smart thing to do. But there's still a huge financing gap when it comes to agricultural enterprises, and even more so when we're talking about women-led and gender-inclusive enterprises. So the more we can all build the business case for gender lens investing, and the more we can share with each other what works well, the closer we're going to get to bridging that gap. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and over to you, Alexandra.
Thank you, Willy. Hi, everybody. Before we talk about the research findings, let me give you a very brief history of Root Capital's Women in Agriculture initiative, which celebrated a decade of impact this year. Now, I know there's a lot to take in on this slide. Please don't worry, we're not going to dig into all of it, but we will send the slides around after the webinar, so you can always take a closer look at all this information at your own leisure. As Willy mentioned, the WAY, which is our shorthand for the Women in Agriculture initiative, grew out of our recognition of the critical role that women play in the growth of agricultural enterprises, very often behind the scenes. While Root Capital reached thousands of women before taking on an explicit gender lens approach, it wasn't an integrated and intentional part of our work until 2012, when we launched the WAY. For the first few years, we focused on defining gender inclusion and on creating a gender scorecard to track relevant metrics in our lending pipeline and in our portfolio. In response to investor interest, we also launched the WAY Note, through which investors can choose to allocate their capital specifically to gender-inclusive enterprises. And we conducted a number of field-based studies to better understand the barriers for women in agriculture. All of this groundwork set us up to think more deeply about gender inclusion in our lending portfolio. In the intervening years, the WAY has expanded significantly. In particular, Root Capital has moved beyond gender-inclusive lending alone and has also piloted non-financial products and services to help our client agricultural enterprises improve gender inclusion themselves. That includes gender equity grants and gender inclusion advisory services, among other things. And if you're interested in learning more about these other aspects, I encourage you to go to the publications page of our website and download the most recent WAY annual report. It's really great. Importantly for today's conversation, in more recent years, we've also conducted a series of gender lens market studies so that we could proactively build a stronger pipeline of gender inclusive enterprises. As a result of all this work, Root Capital has invested $545 million in gender-inclusive and women-led enterprises, reaching more than 500,000 women farmers and employees. And last year, we hit a record high, with 55% of the businesses in our portfolio being gender-inclusive and 27% being women-led. Through our Women in Agriculture initiative, we've pioneered a successful approach to gender lens investing in the agricultural sector, a sector that is highly male dominated. Yet, we're only one investor, and the financing gap for agricultural enterprises and for women in agriculture remains enormous. In just sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia alone, the financing gap for agricultural enterprises is more than $100 billion a year. And the total gender finance gap for small and medium-sized enterprises in emerging markets is estimated to be $1.5 trillion per year. In agriculture specifically, women make up around 45% of the global workforce, but only receive 7% of total investment. So, there is huge room for growth, and that presents both a challenge and a fantastic opportunity for investors. I say opportunity because the business case for investing in women has been getting stronger and stronger over the last decade or more. McKinsey, Catalyst, IFC, and many others have found through extensive research that greater gender diversity, especially in leadership positions, correlates to higher revenues, better returns on investment, so less employee turnover, more innovation, less fraud, you name it. However, there are some major gaps in this data. So far, it's been primarily focused on large businesses in established markets, especially those in advanced economies. There's even less data about the agricultural industry, even though 2.5 billion people globally depend on this sector for their livelihoods. And that is why we set out to do this research and fill those data gaps. So without further ado, I'll hand it off to my colleague, Leonor Gutiérrez, to discuss how we conducted our analysis and what it demonstrates.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, and thank you everybody for joining us this morning. And I just want to, keep on talking about what was our approach to this research. And as Alexandra has mentioned and Willy mentioned as well, for us, it's just very important to start filling gaps in the existing data, especially for the kind of businesses that Root Capital has the honor to work with. And for us, this is about hoping that other investors can use the findings from our analysis to inform and grow their own investment in gender-inclusive enterprises. So hopefully this will inspire you, and this will just let you see beyond and join us in this genderless investment commitment. Okay, so first, I would like to have a few notes about our research methodology. The first thing is that we cover a large and unique data set. As you see on this slide, our data covers 552 borrowers and all from small and growing agricultural enterprises. And they're working in an array of industries and originating from 31 countries across Latin America, Africa, and Indonesia. So all of them emerging markets. Overall, this data represents over 1 billion in Root Capital investments with a range of loan sizes. Second, we look at different levels and aspects of women's participation. So this data is not only looking at the leaders and the owners. We want to see the board members. We want to be looking into the managers or the non-managers employees. And very importantly, this data is looking also at the farmers. And finally, as you'll see in the findings, we examine both business performance, meaning enterprise stability, growth, and access to finance, and loan performance, meaning measures of risk and profitability for investors. The overall findings of our research just demonstrate that gender lens investment is good for women, business, and for investors. So just let me take you to this journey, looking into our data, looking into this analysis. And again, I hope that this will just, make you start an own open conversation about the importance of investing in women. So let's talk about our findings. In our inclusion PACE report, we break down 5 key findings along with related takeaways for investors. You can see them on the slide over here. So let's take a closer look at these findings and what they mean for how we collectively approach investing in women in agriculture in the coming years. So this image is very strong and very powerful in my head, and is the one that women are, or women equal economic powerhouses. Our data shows gender inclusive and women-led businesses are economic powerhouses. They have better overall business performance than non-inclusive enterprises, even in the male-dominated agriculture sector. We see this through 2 key findings: more stable revenues and growth. So across nearly all measures, enterprises with greater women's participation have more stable revenues than enterprises with less women participation. We measure revenue stability using 2 indicators: whether an enterprise experienced an annual revenue dip greater than 25% and the amount of annual revenue variation. We found that on average, women-led and gender-inclusive enterprises see 1/3 smaller annual variation in revenues compared to male-led and non-gender inclusive enterprises. So why does this matter? Well, because revenue stability makes for a stronger business and can also help enterprises with access to financing, like to invest in their business, to pay producers, to pay their employers, and to be eligible for future loans. So this is really, really a very key factor of these findings. And in addition to more stable revenues, and that will be the next slide, enterprises with greater participation of women have very high annual growth rates. We use a global baseline from the OECD that distinguishes high growth enterprises as those 20% compound annual growth rate and 35% average annual growth rate. And as you can see on this slide, in Root Capital's portfolio, gender-inclusive enterprises average year-on-year growth rates of 20.6 CRGR and 35.1 AAGR, which means they are high growth. Women-led enterprises in our portfolio perform even better, averaging year-on-year growth rates of 25.7 CRGR and 45.2 AAGR. And that is, as you can see, well above the OECD baseline. So taken collectively, high growth and more stable revenues are good indicators that women's participation lead to stronger businesses, which is ultimately beneficial for incomes, job creation, and economic growth in rural communities. It is also great news on the investor side. Investors can rely on gender-inclusive enterprises to balance a strong growth and stability, avoiding some of the risks and trade-offs of extreme growth. And now I would like to share with you an example, just one, although we have many, of a women-led enterprise that we have seen grow and thrive over the years, Rwashosco in Rwanda. And first, I would just like to take a look at this picture and see this big smile in Angelique Karekesi's face. She is the leader of this organization. I have the opportunity of personally have meetings with her, and I just can tell you that after the meetings, you feel inspired for days. So Rwashosco is an umbrella organization that markets, roasts, and exports coffee from 6 local cooperatives. And it's and Angelique, here in the picture, has been the managing director since 2014. Within just a few years of her taking on this leadership role, she increased the company's exports by almost 60%. And she also began selling a fully grown line of coffee named Angelique's Finest, that I think the name just suits it so well, on the international market. Even as coffee prices experience volatility and COVID-19 disrupted supply chains and markets, Angelique has led her company with grace, with a steady hand, and with a lot of success. And this takes me just to, to keep on reflecting on how intentionally investing in women benefits lenders themselves. We also found multiple indicators that gender lens investing provides good returns to investors, namely, loans to inclusive enterprises are more profitable. Plus, these borrowers are less likely to default than male-led and non-inclusive enterprises. So again, when we have enterprises with good governance, when we have inclusion, men and women working together, and we make sure that they're gender inclusive, and we give opportunity to talent, these things just start happening, and they're amazing. And we do see permanent change after they happen for the better. So now we're going to talk about the loans and this aspect of more profitable loans. So controlling for the loan size, region, and industry. Loans to women-led enterprises on average yield almost 18,000 more in profits than loans to non-women-led enterprises. Again, as you can see on this slide, just a 10 percentage point increase in the share of female managers and employees is associated with higher loan profits of around 2,000 and 4,000 respectively. These are very large increases, given that the average profit per loan is around 6,000 across the whole portfolio, and Again, this contradicts popular misconceptions that loans to women-led and gender-inclusive enterprises are more expensive to serve. In fact, they generate higher profits to investors. And again, they generate higher profits to investors. So in terms of default rates, we found that women-led enterprises and those with higher percentages of women employees have lower default rates on average. Women-led enterprises have a more than 4 percentage point lower average default rate than non-women-led enterprises, and a 10 percentage point increase in the number of women employees is associated with decreases in default rates. And these numbers are substantial, given that the average default rate across Root Capital's whole client portfolio is around 13.5%. So with all these findings, it's important to remember that investing in women needs to be intentional to really be effective. Women leaders and women-led businesses need tailored investment approaches and products to leverage their potential and maximize results for both the businesses and investors. And now we're going to another example. And this example, again, is really close to my heart because I was very lucky visiting Azoagri in Guatemala around 3 weeks ago. And again, I just would like to share with you that for me on a personal level was an amazing experience. I felt so inspired and I could see Root Capital's theory of change in motion come live, and it was just a very special experience for me. So I'm going to share a little bit with you about this client. So first of all, Azoagri was Root Capital's first client, and it's a coffee cooperative located in a very remote, low-income area. It took us about 12 hours on dirty roads to get there. And from the beginning, its leaders recognized that inclusion will be key, not just for women and men, but for younger and older generations and indigenous peoples. In the case of women farmers, Azoagri had to help them overcome certain barriers. Many were not legally registered with the cooperative because their land, like many women around the world, was not held in their name. And the cooperative had to do intentional work to facilitate women's full participation in the assemblies where members make business decisions. And this took a lot of organization and a lot of intention to make it happen and work. And Root Capital has been there with Azoagri from the beginning, supporting this work through advisory services to improve governance and gender inclusion. Azoagri also invested in a line of women-grown coffee and participates in the Café Femenino program, for which they earn a premium price on their coffee. And it's just so nice to have a cup of coffee with these women and see how their faces come to light, very proud, knowing that their coffee is all around Europe and is one of the highest quality coffee that you can find in the world. So pioneering investments catalyze other financing. So maybe we can move to the next slide. Finally, what I think is perhaps the most exciting finding is that investing in enterprises with greater participation of women catalyzes their access to additional sources of financing. So our data shows that gender inclusive enterprises are associated with an almost 21 percentage point higher likelihood of obtaining new social or commercial financing after having financing only from Root Capital. If we look only at commercial financing options, the hardest for small agricultural enterprises to access, gender inclusive enterprises are still associated with an almost 12 percentage point higher likelihood of accessing additional financing after a loan from Root Capital or another social lender. In practice, we've seen that many lenders operating on the misconception we talked about earlier, that women-led and gender-inclusive enterprises are more expensive or risky to serve, we'll often wait until these enterprises have an established track record. So this is how this research suggests that Root Capital plays a first mover role, demonstrating the potential of investing in these businesses and financing growth that enables them to qualify for other loans. This finding is particularly important as we think about how to collectively close the persistent gender financing gap for small and growing agricultural enterprises. Not only is it possible to build a gender-inclusive investing portfolio, as Root Capital has, it's also a pathway to mobilizing other investors to move in the same direction. And that's probably what's most exciting in all of our research. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you will come and join us. It has been really exciting to see these findings and to share this time with you all this morning.
That's great. Thanks so much, Leo, and also to Ale and Willy. We're now going to move into our question and answer session. But before we do, I'd like to welcome Katie Nave, who is joining us to answer some of the questions you've been posting. Katie is co-author of the Inclusion Page report, and she knows Root Capital's Women in Agriculture initiative very well indeed. So inviting Katie and Ale to join us. So we have a bunch of questions that our webinar attendees have been posting. I'm going to give you two that seem to be kind of related. And the first one is, what has Root Capital learned about how to find gender inclusive and women-led enterprises? How do you build the pipeline? That's the first question. And the second question is kind of related to that. Is there a correlation with the growth of women's businesses with the business stage? Are the women and gender inclusive businesses newer, leading to their faster growth?
Thank you, Scott. I'll be happy to field that first one, and then Katie, if you wanted to build on it as well, feel free to, and I'll hand off the microphone to you for the second question. So how do we build the pipeline? In part, the answer is the way we build our general pipeline, which is that a lot of word of mouth were recommended, but we also conduct very intentional market studies and do intentional outreach. And we conducted very specific market studies to seek out those gender inclusive businesses. And what did we learn? We learned that two things. One, they're out there. They certainly exist, but we also learned that we have a really important role in creating them through training. So there are businesses in our own portfolio, businesses in our pipeline that maybe don't qualify as gender inclusive and that are interested and can get there through training, through support, through the right kind of information on how they can go about doing that. And with that, I'll hand it off to you, Katie.
Great. Thanks, Alexandra, and hi, everyone. Great to be here. Great to see the engagement on this area of research. So on the second question, in terms of the correlation between women-led businesses growth and their stage of growth. So we didn't look at that specific correlation in the analysis, whether earlier stage women-led businesses are growing faster than later stage businesses for this particular research. But other research of Root Capital's portfolio has shown that indeed earlier stage businesses grow faster than later stage businesses, and that growth kind of declines over time. And we didn't find in this analysis that women-led businesses were more likely to be earlier stage than male-led businesses. And so we can roughly deduce that that there isn't a correlation between, or that there is a correlation between growth in the earlier stages as opposed to later stages for both women and men-led businesses in the study.
Great, thank you. Okay, so a question here. Were there any findings that were not as positive? Any surprises in the data?
I don't know if I would say surprises. I think it depends on Katie, you're about to jump in as well. I think it depends on what your expectations were. One of the findings that popped out for me particularly has to do with stability, business stability. Again, not a super surprising finding, but definitely that women-led businesses are more stable in their year-on-year growth and overall performance, which is, you know, a very attractive characteristic from an investment perspective. But I want to respect that Katie looked like she was about to take the microphone to answer that question.
No problem, Ale. So I think we entered this analysis with an open mind, sort of anticipating, given what we know about women in agriculture and women's leadership in agricultural businesses, that they would perform at least as well as male-led businesses. And we know that in other industries and other markets, that inclusion pays in terms of women's representation throughout the business. So our priors were that women would perform at least as well as male-led businesses, and gender inclusive businesses at least as well as less inclusive businesses. And so it was great to find that that was the case, and these businesses perform even better, that inclusion pays, women's leadership pays. And I think one of the surprising findings, but kind of makes sense when you put it all together, is that women-led businesses, although they're growing very fast, they're not growing as fast as male-led businesses. And I think one of the things that helps interpret that finding is the other finding on stability. So women-led businesses may be growing slightly slower than male-led businesses, but they're growing at a rate that's more stable with less year-on-year revenue fluctuations. So it's one finding that was a bit surprising, but is explained sort of in a very positive way through the rest of the data.
Great, thank you. So a comment and a question that go together here. Women agricultural businesses are hugely under-financed, especially in Africa. Thank you for that. And the question is, what specific interventions of Root Capital do you think help women enterprise better attract additional funding?
I'll just like to jump in, because I also like to answer the question, just giving a little bit of context. The company that I presented as OAGRI is an example of a gender inclusive business that is male-led. You know, the executive director of OAGRI is a man. And I just want to say that, because this is not about women on one side and men on the other. This is about people in the communities getting together and actually getting the best out of inclusion and of having a rich team with higher human capital, just because they have more voices that are represented and included in their teams. So I just wanna, I thought that was interesting to add to the conversation, because sometimes when we talk about gender inclusion and investing with the gender lens, it can get like a bit polarized, and I don't think this is the case at all. This is just an example about how coming together. So trying to answer the question from that lens. Well, one thing, it is very important to give women a voice and to give the possibility to get women organized and to be seen. So something important for Root Capital is just to have women being seen and being visible within the organization. And that includes not only bringing them to different workshops and advisory services that Root Capital is already providing out those businesses, but facilitating and promoting and working very close to the management and the leadership within the business to provide the governance and the policies so that women can come together, can raise their voices in these needs in a more organized way, so that it is easier to find the right investors and the right investing that they need specifically for their needs, that many times are needs that are shared with the rest of the farmers or with the rest of the people in their business, but are just not heard, and nobody's really listening or paying attention to them. So this is a process that, as we said, has to be intentional, but at the end of the day, what you have is an agribusiness that is more, that is united, that works stronger together, that understand better its farmers, and that therefore is able to provide better services and to be more resilient regarding the needs of those that are associated with the cooperativa or the agribusiness.
Great, thanks, Leo. I have a couple of questions that I'm going to give you because they're related. And these are questions kind of more on the investor side. The first one is, what are your biggest tips for other investors who wish to fully integrate a gender lens? That's number one. And the second one is, what are the investment opportunities in this space in addition to investing in Root Capital?
Well, I maybe would like just to jump in regarding of where to start. And I would just like to say that I feel very proud of working for Root Capital because they started to look within. And I feel that that is something that is very powerful and that is a good start. You know, looking within their own systems, their own internal, organizational, human resources, and taking a very honest look about if you are operating with a gender lens inside your operation. And also starting to, if the answer is not really, then how you can start incorporating more women in your leadership, more women in board positions, more women in managerial positions, just to be able to have more diversity and more inclusion inside your own operation and business. And then I feel that the next step is just being really honest regarding how you can associate with this amazing, vast ecosystem of impact and non-impact gender investors and people that are just so interested in investing with the gender lens. And I say that because there is a community waiting for all of you just to be part of this movement, if you like to call it. And we do have not only tools, inspiration, the willingness to start a long conversation, but actually we have also like knowledge that we will be just so willing to share, because this is something that, as you know, like another part of the questions, what can we do beside investing in Root Capital? I think that the answer is that Root Capital cannot do this alone. You know, like women in agricultural is still such an underserved part of this agricultural community that I feel that all efforts are important and non-effort will be enough standing on its own. So this is about thinking also collectively about solutions and about investing as a collective and with a gender lens. And hopefully if we do that, we'll start seeing real changes happening at a scale that we want them to happen.
Any other comments from Ale or Katie on those questions?
Sure, maybe just a quick response on what investors can do. I think what investors can do is look at their own portfolio. So oftentimes what we do is we look to the existing evidence like this, other evidence that Calvert has put on the business case for investing in gender diversity. And I would encourage other investors and other lenders to open up their books, look at their data, not only to understand what the business case is within their own portfolio, but to understand where there might be gender gaps. So is it a pipeline issue? Is it a biz dev issue? Is there is the investor having a challenge originating loans to women-led or gender-inclusive businesses? Are they difficult to find, and therefore you may need to approach market studies like Root Capital has done to understand where these women-led and gender-inclusive businesses are in the markets that you work in, and then look at your internal processes and protocols. So is there anything, are there collateral requirements that are inadvertently excluding women from accessing your product? Are your products geared and suited towards women and women entrepreneurs, given all the barriers they face? Are there different terms that you could think about offering? And then, of course, as Root Capital has found, technical assistance plays a big role. So thinking about what is the technical assistance that you could be offering either businesses that are not inclusive, gender technical assistance to help them become more inclusive, or on the other side, working to build the capacity of earlier stage women-led and gender inclusive businesses. So I think looking across the investment process and identifying where are the weaknesses and where you as an investor can move the needle to bring in and reach more women-led and gender-inclusive businesses with the capital they need.
Awesome, thank you. There are a lot of questions being posted around this theme, so I'm going to try and paraphrase them, but I'm surprised by how many there are actually. And it's diving into the kind of the behaviors and the psychology of this. So one question, for example, is what factors contribute to the profitability and growth of women-led businesses? And another is what are the behaviors, decisions, disciplines of women-led businesses that cause or are correlated to less credit risk and increased success and sustainability? Any answers to those?
Excuse me, what was the second one, Scott?
Yeah, the second one is what are the behaviors, decisions, and disciplines of women-led businesses that cause or are highly correlated to less credit risk and increased success and sustainability?
I love those questions because I think that shows how much we want to deep dive into this reflection. I will let Katie answer if she wants to, but my take on that will be that we don't have a specific information regarding what specific moves were done and which women took the lead in which moment. So that level of specificity we don't have. But I will say that, just think about this for a moment. Like the World Cup was just on. How does any team in the world, doesn't matter how good their players are, will make it to the World Cup if it has half of the team at the bench, not able to play, not able to fully participate, being, like in many times, not even seen. So I think that it's not only about, like this thing about what is that specifically women do, but it's also thinking about how much women as humans, as men has done in this male-dominated sector of agriculture, can bring to the table, can bring to the game, and how once they're given the opportunity to be part of the game, to be leaders of the game, they show results. And I will say that is, if you want to go into the psychology of it, that is just because women have so much to give, and we just have to give them the space and the opportunity to show it. But yeah, if you ask me if there is just something super special, I wouldn't know if there's something super special that you could say about women when comparing to men, because I feel that, and research is showing more and more that is about humanity and about human capital and about being able to put our skills on the table. And just think about that for a minute. Women, especially in agriculture, haven't been able to put their skills to the service of their businesses. Because culturally, and for many societal, economical barriers, like the one we just saw in the presentation, that most of them are not, they're not legally owners of their lands, for example, and so on and so forth. We can come with examples. They just haven't been part of the game. So this invitation is to help them to become part of the game, knowing that they bring so much to it.
Yeah, thanks, Leo. And maybe just to add a bit onto what Leo said, we didn't look into all of the different ways that women's behavior might differ from men's and how that might be correlated with some of the findings that we're seeing. But we did see a couple of things. So as was presented, women-led businesses are more stable and see less revenue shifts year on year. And so that is likely correlated with their ability to repay loans, to access other sources of financing. If they performed better on existing loans, they're more likely to get loans in the future, whether from the same lender or from others. We also see higher repayment rates, and those repayment rates are going to influence their ability to access future capital, of course, and manage their business. It's more than just being able to pay back a loan. It's demonstrative of how they're running their businesses. And then also one of the findings that didn't make it into the report, but we did find is that women-led and gender-inclusive businesses have a longer tenure with Root Capital. So not the tenure of each individual loan, but are accessing loans year on year for longer than male-led and less inclusive businesses. And so that shows a level of loyalty a level of relationship building with lenders. And, you know, if we look to the barriers that women face in leading and participating in agricultural businesses, we might, you know, there's a couple of reasons why we think that might be the case. Women face more barriers to accessing financing in the first place. They're using their own capital from family members, so maybe they have more to lose. They don't have the opportunity to access capital that men have. And they are highly dependent on building relationships. They're not in the same networks, in the same markets, have the same access to buyers that male-led businesses have. And so that's probably leading them to really value and be loyal to the relationships that they have built. So I think there's a number of barriers that we can link to why we're seeing what we're seeing in the data in terms of women's performance. But as mentioned earlier, we didn't go into the specific behaviors that we think are leading to the stability, loan repayment, and revenue outcomes.
Great, thank you both. A question here, helping businesses become more gender inclusive has been mentioned. What has worked in this regard, and have the businesses asked for this?
Happy to take that, or have you, Leo?
No, I just want to comment that we have launched formally our gender equity advisory services, and we have, you know, like we're just really excited because to your question, if the clients are interested in this kind of services, if they're interested in just, you know, like doing something within their companies and being willing to sit down with the managers and the leaders and having open conversations to see how is that they're going to bring women inclusion, the answer is yes, they're interested. And I feel that Root Capital has the ability to start this kind of conversations because of the proximity that it has with our clients, and because the market is changing and the demands of the market are changing as well. And I feel that around the world, consumers are more and more interested in where our goods are coming from, where the food is coming from, where our coffee is coming from. And there is just, you know, like the right momentum to bring these topics to the table. And of course, because the results speak for themselves. And when we have clients that see other clients being successful, implementing gender inclusive policies, and that are being successful by bringing their middle management, that are usually women, into our workshops, and then having this middle management grow and be even more skillful and bringing more assets to the business, they start getting interested because they see this is not only because it's the right thing to do, this is the smart thing to do. And it's something that takes time, that takes sometimes hard conversations, but with the right support. And it's something that at Root Capital, we're feeling really proud. We're starting just to, you know, get the track of this gender advisory services. We just started last year, but we're already seeing so many, you know, client engagement and so many things and positive things coming out of it that we just can't wait to share with you in the near future the result of this more formal approach encompassing this gender equity advisory services. So thank you for your question.
I think we've got time for a couple more. I have one here. Someone who is curious about the difference in loan sizes pre-root and post-root, or how much more credit were the women-owned businesses able to secure with root, and what was the impact on the growth of the business?
Yeah, I can take that. The women-led and male-led businesses were accessing loans around there was no difference in loan size in the analysis that we did, because we controlled for loan size when we looked at these findings. But if you go to the end of the report, there are some summary statistics that show loan size by type of business, average loan size by type of business, whether gender inclusive, women-led, et cetera. And in terms of financing, there were no differences we found no differences at the time of the first Root Capital loan between women-led businesses and male-led businesses, gender inclusive versus non-gender inclusive, in terms of access to other sources of financing. So at the time of their first loan, there were no differences that we found in terms of access to other sources of financing. But what we did find was with Root Capital's initial loan, businesses that had no other access to financing, women-led businesses were more likely to access additional financing from social or commercial lenders. And we found that businesses, that women-led businesses that only had access to Root Capital and other social lenders were more likely to access commercial financing after their loan from Root Capital. So we don't know to what degree loan size or longevity with Root Capital is then correlated with some of these other outcomes, but we do know that even if sort of before their first loan from Root Capital, male-led and women-led businesses have the same, roughly on average, access to other sources of financing, with their first Root Capital loan, they're able to access more diverse sources of financing.
Great, thanks, Katie. I think we've got time for one more, and I've been sitting on this question because it is the killer question with which to end the webinar. So thank you, whoever posted this. And the question is fairly simple. What will it take to scale up financing to women-led and gender-inclusive businesses?
I will jump in, but I invite, since it's the last one, please Leo and Katie also chime in. I think it takes building off the lessons from this report, which tell us that it's worth doing it, for one. Also back to one of the responses around investors and how to do it. It takes intentionality, really making a point of going out and seeking out those businesses, making a point of conducting an analysis of each of our own portfolios to understand and therefore be able to address what those barriers might be. It takes partnerships. It takes collaboration. I think all the stakeholders in this world, in this sector, bring different contributions to the table at Root Capital. Partnerships are key to our success, and definitely our Women in Agriculture initiative is built through partnerships as well. So it takes, for example, using these lessons through partnerships to understand how can we work together to scale, to apply these lessons. And it takes definitely technical assistance, as I think we've mentioned multiple times now as well. Patience, a lot of patience and time, and continuing to build the evidence base and the data, because every time we unpack the data, we discover a little bit more, we understand a little bit more about what those barriers are, what the learnings are. And I would add one more, which is sort of very important for us at Root Capital internally, is to set the bar high and then set it higher. So when we set out to do this, we conducted our own analysis and we said, what is that definition? And we set a high bar around the percentage of gender inclusive and women-led businesses that we want to reach in our portfolio. And as our portfolio grows, our overall portfolio grows, we haven't let our guard down on that bar. And one of our priorities moving forward is to test that bar and see if it's high enough. See if we need to double down on the standard we're holding ourselves to, and continuous learning. But I'd like to give both Katie and Leonor an opportunity to weigh in as well. Thank you.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in next. Thanks, Alexandra. I would sum it up in terms of two things we need. One is moving capital into the hands of women in agriculture, whether that is development finance, whether it is investment capital from impact investors or commercial banks, moving capital into the hands of women leaders and women working in agriculture. 7% is unacceptable of total funding that's going to women in agriculture, given the huge role that women play in agriculture and the potential that they have. So moving capital, getting it into the hands of women. And then the other is, if we only invested in agricultural businesses that are led by women or are already gender inclusive, as Root Capital's portfolio shows, we're leaving at least half of the businesses on the table. So, you know, in addition to investing in women-led and gender inclusive businesses, those businesses that are already doing good for women, we need to also focus on those businesses that are not and build the capacity of those businesses to transform themselves and transform the lives of women. And that's through capacity building, technical assistance, helping businesses identify their gaps and barriers towards becoming more gender inclusive and more transformative for women in their communities. So I would wrap it up as those two things: capital and training for businesses that are not quite there yet. Pass it over to you, Leonor.
Thank you. Well, in addition to what both Alexandra and Katie shared that I completely feel as well, I would just like to tell our audience that I know that there are many leaders from different sectors sharing this morning with us that you need to give this the BIP treatment. And for me, it's the vision, the involvement, and the persistence. And just take action, go and do it. You know, the data is there, the right partners are there, the ecosystem is building, the consumers want it, you know, the market demands it. And it's something that it's really so important for our future. Like, we cannot imagine a future where we don't have women inclusion in agriculture. We don't have the luxury of time. We need to take action now, and we have the evidence to do it. So for me, it's just an invitation to all these leaders that are listening to us right now, just to go ahead and do it. And you know that you can find a partner in Root Capital, as we have found partners in many of you attending this call. And again, you know, it's a matter of vision, involvement, and persistence. It's not going to happen on its own. We just need to take action and make it happen. And we're all welcome. We're all invited to do this. So thank you. And that will be the answer for me. Thank you very much for attending.
So thanks very much, everyone. I think we've got a great call to action there. Unfortunately, we're at time for this webinar. As I mentioned at the start, we will provide written responses to the questions that we haven't been able to answer here today, and we'll email those out. A massive thank you to Ali, to Leo, to Katie, and to Willy for today's program, and to all of you for joining us and posting such great questions. If you want to follow up on anything that you heard mentioned or discussed during the webinar, please feel free to reach out to me in the first instance, and I'll make sure that your inquiry gets to the right person. Thank you, everyone. Thanks very much for attending, and have a great day. Bye.